I was taken away from my parents and was separated from my sister and brother for many years. As a child, the heroine loses her parents and finds herself in a foster home. After years of struggle and hardship, she decides to seek out her family. Her journey takes her to a small town in Ohio, where she finds her childhood home. But instead of warm reunions, she is faced with difficult discoveries: her sister's illness, a lost connection with her mother, and the bitter truth about her past. In search of answers to questions about her origins, the heroine encounters difficulties that test her fortitude and faith in the best. I sat on the porch of an old house that once belonged to my mother. There was silence all around, broken only by the rustling of leaves underfoot and the rare cries of crows somewhere in the distance. The house had been abandoned for years, but I felt at home here, if only because it was the only place that connected me to my past. When I was 5 years old, social services took me away from my parents. They said my parents were alcoholics and drug addicts, that they couldn't take care of me properly. It was a cold winter evening and I remember snow falling outside, covering the ground with a soft white blanket. It was warm inside the house, but the air felt heavy and stifling. My parents were arguing in the kitchen, their voices growing louder and harsher. I sat in the corner of the living room, playing with my dolls, trying to drown out the noise of their arguments. There was a knock on the door. I froze, not knowing what to do. The door opened and uniformed men walked in. One of them came up to me and told me to go with them. I didn't understand anything. I looked at my mom, she was crying, but obeyed. Taking me by the hand, he led me to the exit. I looked back and saw my little sister clinging to my mom, and my older brother standing aside, looking at us with disbelief and fear. My little sister was taken in the arms of another woman, and my brother was taken by the hand and also led to the exit. The unfamiliar woman squeezed my hand tightly and led me to the car. My brother and sister followed us, their small footsteps crunching faintly on the snow. We walked in silence, no one daring to say a word. It was cold inside the car, despite the engine running. The three of us sat in the back seat, huddled together for warmth. Everyone loaded into the car, and the car started up. Through the window, I could see our house slowly moving away. The windows glowed with warm light, giving the illusion of coziness and tranquility. But I knew there was chaos inside. My mother's sobs echoed in my head, and my father's voice, full of anger and despair, continued to echo somewhere far away. Their figures flickered outside the windows like shadows, and I knew it was the last time I would see them. My parents were still there, in this house that was no longer our home. Everything I knew was gone in the blink of an eye. The car rolled down the snowy streets, leaving familiar places behind. I stared out the window, watching my world shrink and dissolve into the darkness of the night. My brother and sister were silent, their eyes staring ahead. No one knew what would happen next. We were driving off into the unknown, leaving behind all of our former lives. In that moment, I realized that my life had changed forever. Everything I knew was behind me, and now I had to start a new journey, a journey full of unknowns and fears. I was placed alone in a foster home. At first, everything was foreign and unfamiliar. New people, new rules, new home. But with time I got used to it. The new family turned out to be really kind and caring. I had new friends, new interests, and life began to get better. However, despite all this, I never forgot that I had a real mother and father, a sister and brother whom I never saw again. Time passed, and some moments from the past began to fade from my memory. Sometimes I caught myself thinking that I had forgotten what my mom looked like, what her voice was like, or the name of the dog that lived in our old house. But one thing remained constant: the feeling that I had to go back to where I was taken from. As an adult, I began to actively search for information about my family. It was not an easy task. Many documents had been lost or destroyed, and those that had survived were inaccessible. I applied to various organizations, wrote letters, made phone calls, but each time I faced another obstacle. It seemed that the past was being deliberately hidden from me. Each rejection, each failed attempt made me doubt my success, but I kept searching. I wanted to know what had happened to my family, why we were separated, and where my sister and brother had gone. Still, I managed to find the address of my parents' house. It was in a small town in Ohio, not far from where I had grown up. I packed my things and bought a train ticket to Ohio. The trip took a few hours, and the whole time I couldn't calm down. My mind was filled with questions. What would I find there? Would I learn anything about my family? The town was small and cozy, with narrow streets and old houses. People greeted each other in a friendly way that made it seem as if time stood still. I found the house quickly. It was almost on the outskirts of town. The mowed lawn outside the house itself looked better than the last time I saw it. I recognized it anyway. I felt it was the right place. Everything was familiar, the old trees, the path to the house, even the smell of the grass reminded me of my childhood. It was exactly the place I had been taken from many years ago. When I got to the door, I summoned all my courage and knocked. My heart was pounding so hard that it felt like it was about to jump out of my chest. But there was no answer. I knocked again, but again there was no answer. So I went around the house, hoping to find some clue. Suddenly I noticed that there was a curtain hanging from the second-story window, moving slightly in the breeze. So there were people living here. Returning to the front door, I knocked again. After a while, the door was opened by a middle-aged man. He looked at me in surprise, apparently not expecting a visit. "Greetings," I began, trying to speak calmly. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm looking for information about the people who lived in this house many years ago. Do you happen to know what happened to them?" We went into the living room and he invited me to sit down. The man told me that he had bought the house a few years ago and knew nothing about the previous owners. He showed me the pictures hanging on the walls and told me about his family. It turned out that he lives here with his wife and 2 children. "I'm sorry I can't help you," he said. "But if you want, you can look in the local archives or contact the mayor's office. Maybe they'll have the information you need." I thanked the man for his help and left. Although the meeting had not yielded any concrete results, I did not give up hope. Back at the hotel, I decided to take the advice and went to the local city hall the next morning. There I explained my situation to a staff member and asked for help in finding information about my family. To my surprise, the employee was very helpful. He took me to the archives department and started looking for records of past owners of the house. After a few hours of searching, we were able to find some data. It turned out that my parents had sold the house shortly after I was taken and moved to another state. However, there was no clue as to where they were now. But then the caseworker noticed something interesting. One of the documents mentioned an orphanage where my sister and brother had been sent. This gave me hope. I immediately went to the orphanage, which was located in a neighboring town. The orphanage was a large building surrounded by a high fence. Once inside, I approached the director and asked for information about my sister and brother. The director, an elderly man with kind eyes, listened to me and agreed to help. After a short wait, he returned with a folder containing documents on my brother and sister. From them I learned that after we were separated, they too had been sent to different foster homes. The director gave me the contact details of my sister and brother. I couldn't believe my happiness. I had finally found them. Thanking the man, I hurried back to the hotel to contact them. I called my sister first, but the phone was picked up by a woman. The voice was polite but stern. I asked to hand over the phone, but the woman replied that the sister could not come to the phone. She clarified that the sister was in the hospital and it was difficult for her to talk. These words took my breath away. I asked where the hospital was and the woman gave me the address. Without wasting time, I rushed into a cab and drove straight there. The hospital was old, with long corridors and dim lighting. Finding the nurse's room, I entered and saw her. She was lying on a bed, hooked up to many machines and tubes. Her face was pale, her hair sparse and thin. To see her in such a state was unbearably hard. The nurse next to me noticed my condition and suggested that I sit down. I sank down on the chair beside the bed and took my sister's hand. She opened her eyes weakly and looked at me. I saw tiredness and pain in her eyes, but also a slight glimmer of joy. "Hi," I whispered, holding back tears. "I'm your sister." She smiled weakly and whispered back, "I know. I always believed that we would find each other. Thank you for coming." Her voice was weak, but full of warmth. We spent a few hours together talking about the past, about our memories. She told me that she had forgotten a lot of things, but always felt that she had a family that she had lost. We cried and laughed, sharing the few memories we had. When it was time to leave, I promised her that I would definitely come back. She nodded and smiled again. I kissed her forehead and left the room, feeling my heart break with pain and happiness at the same time. At home, I couldn't sleep for a long time, thinking about our meeting. The next day I received a message from the nurse that my sister's condition had worsened and the doctors were doing everything they could to alleviate her suffering. In the evening, I called my brother. His voice sounded confident and friendly. He was happy to hear from me and promised to come as soon as possible. We agreed to meet the next day at the same cafe where I had planned to see my sister. When we met, I could see that my brother had grown into a strong and confident man. He hugged me and we both cried. He told me that he always remembered that he had a family, trying to find us. We talked about his sister and he promised to go to the hospital to visit her. After the meeting, my brother and I decided to continue our search for our mother. My brother took the lead and started looking for information on the internet, contacting various organizations and social services. It took several weeks before we got the first results. One morning my brother called me and told me that he had found an address where our mother probably lived. We agreed to go there together. The address turned out to be a small house in the suburbs surrounded by a garden. As we approached the house, we saw that it looked well maintained but modest. We knocked on the door and after a few moments it opened. Standing before us was an elderly woman with gray hair and tired eyes. Despite her age, I recognized our mother's features in her face. She looked at us carefully, and her gaze settled on me. "Mom?" I whispered, not believing my eyes. The woman nodded and invited us in. We walked into the small living room, which was cozy and warm. She offered us tea, and we sat down at the table. There was an awkward silence, which was interrupted by my mother. "I've always thought of you," she began, looking at us sadly. "After you were taken away, our life got worse. Your father passed away a year after you left. I tried to cope with the grief, but alcohol and drugs took over." She paused to pull herself together and continued, "Left on my own, I found myself in debt. I had to sell my house to pay off my debts. Life was hard, but I tried to survive for you. I struggled with addiction, treatment, it took me a long time. I always hoped I could find you." We listened to her without interrupting. It was painful to hear how hard it had been for her, but at the same time we were relieved to finally know the truth. "Why didn't you look for us before?" my brother asked, looking at my mother with hope and pain. "I tried," she answered, her head down. "But everything was against me. I lost my documents, my contacts disappeared. Social services didn't want to help. I didn't give up, but eventually hope faded. I thought you'd forgotten me." As I hugged her, I felt her start to cry. Those tears were a mixture of joy and grief. I shared with her the news about my sister and we decided to go to her place. The whole day was spent talking about our lives, sharing memories and dreams for the future. My mother promised that from now on we would communicate regularly and support each other. So, after many years of separation, our family came together again. We realized that despite all the difficulties and trials, love and affection remain the most important things in life. A few months passed. We started seeing each other often, calling each other, sharing news. My mother started a new life, she found a job, moved to another city, met new friends. And I finally felt a full part of this family.